This is episode 24 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Philippa Brawl, writer and lead historian at British History Tours. Another great method for studying history of Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
And John Shakespeare got himself into pretty deep water because one of the documents shows that he'd signed a bond to obey the Exchequer Court and its orders. And the bond was for 200 marks. Now, 200 marks was about £133. £133 in the 1570s is something like £20,000 today.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
For years, historians have ruminated on the state of William Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare. We knew that John Shakespeare had financial troubles, but we were left to speculate as to whether or not these financial troubles caused the bard to leave grammar school, and without any real substantial evidence to confirm or deny what actually happened to John Shakespeare, we've been left to wonder what, if any, impact these troubles had on the budding young playwright. We've been wondering, that is, until now. Dr. Glyn Parry has just this last week uncovered new documents at the National Archives in London that have shed light on William Shakespeare's early life by listing details about John Shakespeare's financial trouble, what debts he owed, how he paid them, what happened when he ended up at court. And all of these documents help us understand how some of Shakespeare's political views might have been formed in his childhood. Glyn Parry is a professor of early modern studies at the University of Roehampton, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a member of the American Historical Association, and member of the History of Science Society. His work focuses on early modern magic, Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's environment, as well as Tudor government in action. He often does research at the National Archives, and he joins us today to explore the discovery of these new documents and explain how this new discovery offers an exciting glimpse into the young Shakespeare and how he became the dramatist with strong political views that we know him as today. Hello, Glyn. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, what research were you doing when you found these papers? Were you looking for information on John Shakespeare in the first place?
I was. With my co-author, I'm actually writing a book on young William Shakespeare up to about 1592. My co-author is Dr. Catherine Ennis of Birmingham University here in England, and she knows more about Warwickshire than almost anybody in the Elizabethan period. So we're doing a joint thing where I really work at the National Archives here, and I do what you might call the archival searching, and I find what you might call the national political end of things. And she knows an awful lot about the local end. So we've been working for some years now on a biography of William Shakespeare that uses local and national archives in ways that have never been done before. So I was definitely looking for information on John Shakespeare. In fact, what I had to do back in April was to write a chapter about John Shakespeare. Now, a fair amount's been discovered about John Shakespeare in the last 150 years. And recently, some people have written some general articles and essays about him. But my problem was that back in 1984, two people published an article which looked at some Exchequer court cases in which John Shakespeare had been informed against by a professional informer for breaking the law against usury. At the time, you weren't allowed to charge interest on a loan at all. He'd been twice informed upon to the Exchequer for lending money at very high interest rates, about 25%. And also there were laws against dealing in wool unless you were a merchant of the staple, a member of a specific trading company. He wasn't, and he was dealing in wool. So the people who published the article back in 1984, having looked at the 5 documents in the National Archives that they had then, had concluded that John Shakespeare had quite quickly resolved these cases out of court, paid small fines or perhaps a bribe to the informer, and that he'd then been left alone. So by about 1573, when William was somewhere around 9 years old, it was all done with. It was finished. The other problem is that some years later, in January 1577, John Shakespeare ceased to attend the meetings of Stratford Town Council when he was an alderman. He was a senior figure in the council. He'd been mayor one year and so on and so forth. So John Shakespeare had this gap in his record. What I was trying to do was to try and connect the earlier allegations of usury and wool dealing with his ceasing to attend council meetings. There had been some evidence discovered of his debts in the 1570s, but I really wasn't satisfied with the story. So whenever I hit a brick wall at the National Archives, I go to what's called their alphabetical analysis of their holdings. And this is a massive series of volumes which alphabetically from A to Z, as they say, tells you what's in specific parts of the National Archives. So if you're looking for Exchequer, you're looking under the letter E, and you look under a given number, and this analysis tells you in a sentence or two what's in this particular collection of documents. Then you have to go to a large folder, which gives you far more detail about those documents if you're lucky. And when I was looking for this, I was lucky. Someone about 25 years ago had written a 6 or 7 page summary about these documents. They hadn't actually told anyone what was in the documents individually. There was no list of the documents. There was no analysis. There was no calendar. There was no index. What you got is a 6 page general description saying that in these many hundreds of boxes, there is this kind of document.
Somewhere in the many hundreds of boxes.
Yeah, somewhere. And what the point was that for each box might have about 6 months worth of documents for certain counties in England, which would have a number. And you had to look at the dates and order up the boxes. Now, the boxes are stored in a salt mine in Cheshire, in northwest England. A disused salt mine because it keeps constant temperature and humidity. It's a really great place to keep.
I was about to say, well, of course, that's where I keep my boxes, is a salt mine.
That's right. Somewhere cool and dark. Those are the documents that aren't used very often at the National Archives in Kew in London. So you order them and they're sent down by van from northwest England, and they arrive 3 or 4 or 5 days later, and you start looking. Now, all you've got is a box inside which there could be 100 or so documents, there could be several hundred, there could be up to 1,000 documents. The files are sort of organized very roughly in order of counties alphabetically. So I was looking for Warwickshire, and I found Warwickshire, and I started looking in the years, in the box that sort of fitted the year in which John Shakespeare was having these legal troubles. So I had a pretty good idea of where, if there was anything, where it would be. Unfortunately, quite soon after starting looking, I began to find documents relating to John Shakespeare.
Well, I don't mean this to be an impertinent question, I guess, but it was interesting to me that it's not like we bulldozed a building and uncovered something we didn't know existed before. You were looking around in records that have literally just been sitting there waiting on someone to find this. Why is it that no one has found this before? Is this a testament to, advancements in technology that helped you locate it in the first place? Or are you just the first person that went looking here for that?
I think it's partly to do with money. The National Archives really became a national institution here as the Public Record Office in the mid-19th century. and it collected together lots of national government documents that had been stored all over London and all over England for about 500 years. Its records go back to the year 975. So what it has is many tens of millions of documents. In fact, no one knows how many documents the National Archive has. If you go to their online catalogue, they have, I forget what the number is, tens of millions of documents identified in quite good detail on the online catalogue. That is a small percentage of what they have. In many cases, there are hundreds and hundreds of boxes under a given number, a given reference number, in which no one knows what's inside them, because there simply hasn't been the money to employ the very skilled people it would require to open the box, analyze the documents, write an accurate description of them, and tell whoever is looking, whoever is researching, what each individual document actually says.
I mean, what we're discovering here, or at least what you're emphasizing with having found this, is that when it comes to researching William Shakespeare, it might not be that we don't have records about his life, but simply that they're buried inside the archives somewhere and we haven't found them yet.
That's correct, because what it needs is time and sheer effort. I was looking at about 108 boxes, as I say, between 100 or so and maybe 1,000 documents in each box.
So what did you find? How many documents did you find?
Well, I found about 20 odd. It depends how you count them. They're mostly to do with the process of sending out writs from the Exchequer Court in London to the Sheriff of Warwickshire. Now, the Exchequer at the time was not just a tax-raising and spending body. It had its own court of equity. It had judges sitting in the court, barons of the Exchequer they were called, legally trained lawyers who were judges to decide financial cases, allegedly between the Crown and people in the country, or often actually between individuals who pretended that they owed the Crown money, and unless this case was heard in the Exchequer, they couldn't pay the Queen. That kind of fiction was taken on. Now, these writs were sent out at regular intervals by officials in the Exchequer, sent to the sheriff of the county, who in theory was supposed to find the person summoned by the writ and arrest them and seize their goods and so on, and make sure they turned up at the court in Westminster. That was the theory. It was a kind of formal dance, rather like the sort of court formal dances you had at the time. No one really expected the sheriff to go looking for these people. The sheriff didn't have the staff. He didn't have the resources. He'd received many hundreds of these every year. There was no intention that the sheriff should actually go looking for John Shakespeare. What the sheriff would do was to write on the back of the writ, the aforementioned John Shakespeare is not to be found in my bailiwick, that is in my county. He's not here. Now, the purpose of sending the writ, this is one of the technicalities of the process, was to establish first that it was being sent to the right county, and second, that the Exchequer had jurisdiction over John Shakespeare. So writing that on the back of the document was a way of saying, the sheriff saying, yes, he owes you money, but there's nothing I can do. You see, one of the problems for the sheriff was not only did they have no real staff to do this, but if they arrested the wrong person, they could be legally challenged by the wrong person and would face a hefty fine and for damages. So these documents are sent out to the sheriff, and the sheriff sends them back saying, John Shakespeare can't be found. He knows perfectly well where John Shakespeare is. So the Exchequer then sends out a series of other documents. Now, as time goes on, it becomes much more difficult for John Shakespeare, because the news gets out that he owes the Queen money and that therefore his credit is a problem. You see, what John Shakespeare did, he wasn't just a glover, he was a businessman. He bought and sold commodities. He would very often buy things on credit, sell them for cash, and then pay back the person he got the goods on credit from with the cash he raised by selling them. Wool, for example. The problem was that if his goods were seized by the Crown, while he had a warehouse full of wool that he'd bought on credit from other people, that will be forfeit to the crown.
Then he can't pay back his people.
That's right. He can't pay back his people, and people would stop letting him have things on credit because they might be lost. The crown might seize them.
Wow.
And if you borrowed money from John Shakespeare, well, you could always extend the loan or the period of the loan or change the payments or whatever. If you borrowed money from John Shakespeare and his assets were seized by the crown, that included anybody who owed him money. So he'd have written records of X owes me £50. Well, that £50 was then seized by the Queen for John Shakespeare's debts. And John Shakespeare got himself into pretty deep water because one of the documents shows that he'd signed a bond to obey the Exchequer Court and its orders. And the bond was for 200 marks. Now, 200 marks was about £133. £133 in the 1570s is something like £20,000 today. So this is a whacking great obligation that he owed to the crown if he didn't obey the court. And for some reason, we don't know why, he forfeited the bond. He didn't obey the instructions of the court, and the bond therefore became collectible. It's like not answering your bail. It's like a bail bond, that kind of thing. So he was deeply in debt to the crown, potentially. Now, this process of sending out writs and the sheriff pretending to look for John Shakespeare, not finding him, went on for several years, but it eventually turned into something much more serious, because eventually John Shakespeare ends up on a list of people who owe money to the crown. In fact, not just once, but twice. He's on the same list twice. Once for one of his wool dealing cases, and another time for one of his usury cases. So now these larger documents give the sheriff much greater power to collect the money that John Shakespeare owes to the Queen. And these documents emerge in the late 1570s. About 1576, 1577, they're sent out to the sheriff, and they give the sheriff much more power over John Shakespeare to enforce him to pay. And by the late 1570s, when we know from other evidence that John Shakespeare is in serious financial trouble, it's these debts that he owes to the Queen that cause him problems. So this is where William Shakespeare is now in his late teen years. He's coming up to 18 years old. By the time he's married, and Anne Hathaway has their first child.
I mean, they already have Susanna at this point.
Yes, that's right. He's living in the family home. His father's financial troubles are connected to the way that the informer system is bearing down on people like John Shakespeare, who are kind of entrepreneurial businessmen. John Shakespeare's a wealthy figure in Stratford in the 1560s, early 1570s. He's one of the top 10 or 12 people in the town. He's a central figure.
Well, I mean, I've read that this particular financial episode was part of the reason William Shakespeare isn't on record as graduating from grammar school is because his father's financial troubles required that they pull the young William Shakespeare out of school. But this that you're telling us suggests that Shakespeare was well beyond the age of grammar school, already married with his first child when this really came to bear. Did you find anything in these documents that kind of connects those things?
Yeah, to begin with, the first thing we have to say is we don't have any attendance records for Stratford Grammar School. We don't know when people started, and we don't know when people left. There's just nothing left.
Anybody, not just Shakespeare.
Anybody, not just Shakespeare, absolutely anybody. There's nothing left about Stratford Grammar School's attendances. Also, we don't know what was taught at Stratford Grammar School. I'll come back to that in a bit. So what we're having to do is that most biographers of Shakespeare of William Shakespeare accept that he did attend grammar school, at a minimum for about 4 years, because of his knowledge of Latin, which was actually much more extensive than Ben Jonson claimed. Ben Jonson went to a much more prestigious school, Westminster School in London, which is still with us, of course, as a what we call in Britain a public school, a private school. So Ben Jonson rather looked down on William Shakespeare's country education at Stratford Grammar School. But William Shakespeare actually got a very solid grounding in Latin grammar and Latin literature and Latin rhetoric. And most people accept that this emerges in his writing later on, that he uses a lot of Latin grammatical structures in his writing of English, that he shows a great deal of knowledge about the Latin writers of the late Republic, the early Empire, that he uses poets like Horace, for example, whose work had not been translated when he's using them in the 1590s. So he's using them in Latin. So William Shakespeare definitely had a good grammar school Latin education for about the time that most people went. But we can't definitely prove when he started at Stratford Grammar School or any other grammar school, or when he left. What we can say is this, that his father's financial troubles was still an issue for William when he reached the age of 18, 19 or so. It hadn't been over when he was 9 years old. It went on for another decade. Now, the marriage, of course, actually had a big impact on William Shakespeare's life. It had ever been possible for Shakespeare to go to university. Being married stopped it. An undergraduate at university could not be married. It was against the rules. You couldn't go to university if you were married. Also, you couldn't enter an apprenticeship if you were married. Apprentices had to wait until they'd finished their 7-year apprenticeship before they could get married. They had to save up. So the rules meant that marrying Anne Hathaway meant he couldn't become apprentice to anyone and he couldn't enter university. So that is why he didn't have a university education. But his education in the grammar school at Stratford is very significant for his later writings. Everyone accepts that. And it's because of the particular nature of what he was taught and what he was taught in. He was taught, as I said, in the literature, the Latin literature of the late Republic and the early Empire. People like Ovid, people like Horace, people like the historian Livy, especially the historian Tacitus and the writer Lucan and many others. Now, these people all tended to lament the end of the Roman Republic and what they understood as Roman virtue, and to look around the early empire under these monarchs, which is what they were, these emperors, and to see low-born men of low moral standing and behavior flourishing because of their service to monarchs. You look at under Tiberius, for example, the secret policeman Sejanus and his army of informers corrupting the state. So all these writers write about corruption. They write about the immoral servants of monarchy. Well, William Shakespeare, of course, could look around his world and find in his own household an example of an utterly immoral informer who had devastated his own family.
Well, okay, you say that, but that was my next question, because up until I started reading about this discovery, and it's been kind of a hot topic this week that you found these, and I've read several articles where you're quoted as saying John Shakespeare was victimized. And I do want you to explain that, because it sounds like he legitimately owed debts that he didn't pay.
No, the victimization came in this way. This is the interesting part about the informer system. Okay, this is how it should work in theory. In theory, someone finds out that someone is breaking the law by lending money at interest or dealing in wool. Now, the informer should then go to the Court of Exchequer and appear before the barons of the Exchequer, the judges of the Exchequer, and say, John Shakespeare, between these dates, with these people, was dealing in wool, or lent this person so much money at so much interest to be repaid on this particular date. And therefore he's broken the law and he has to be punished. I will share the fine with the Queen. The Queen will get half the fine and I will get the other half. Now that's what's supposed to happen in theory. What actually happened in practice is something much more corrupt. The informers struck up relationships with the officials who worked in the bureaucracy of the Exchequer. The officials, for a fee, would write out writs to the informers without the informers starting a case in the Exchequer. It was expensive. You had to get lawyers. You had to pay fees to start a case in the Exchequer. So it was much cheaper to get a corrupt Exchequer official to write out the writs for you with no ongoing case. According to Robert Greene, the man who famously called Shakespeare the upstart crow, some of these writs actually had blanks for people's names and their offences to be filled in by the informer. So the informer would go out with these writs, and there were thousands of these written every year. One person complaining in Parliament said between 6,000 and 8,000 people in England were being tormented by these informers. What the informers were doing was a national scandal. John Shakespeare was not the first person to be victimized by the same informer in Stratford. He wasn't the last. There were many other people in Stratford who were informed against by this man. His name was James Langrake, and he was one of about 12 or 15 really very, very busy professional informers in Elizabethan England. Langrake was informing against people from between Lincolnshire on the northeast coast of England down to Somerset in the southwest, and from Staffordshire, which was northwest of Warwickshire, right down to Kent and Sussex in the southeast. James Langrake was an absolutely horrible individual. He was terribly violent. He was very aggressive, very self-centered, and focused on making as much money as possible that he could from this trade of informing. So these writs being sent out through the sheriff were being sent out essentially through a corrupt system. So John Shakespeare wasn't singled out. John Shakespeare was one of thousands of people who was being victimized by a corrupt system. Attempts were made in Parliament by reformers to stop this system, but they were actually opposed by the Queen, her courtiers, and those who wanted to get on the Queen's good side, because the Queen was, in a sense, making quite a good living out of these things if the system worked properly. She also gave her courtiers the rights to collect these fines through the informer system, and many of them made large sums of money. So when people got up in Parliament and tried to complain about it, they were told to back off. Courtiers got up and said, well, this is all perfectly legal. This is how the law is. People should obey the law.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, should. But what's really going on, of course, is a corrupt system. And of course, the other thing is the writs that went through the sheriff to put John Shakespeare under pressure were only part of the story. We've lost a lot of the other form of writs that were handed out to the informers directly by the judges in the courts. These are the writs of subpoena. These are very like the modern writs of subpoena. You are ordered under this punishment to appear in court on this day. Now the informers and their servants would actually deliver these in person. And it's quite likely, though the records are lost, that James Langrake or his servant, a man we know about called John Breed, I've written a chapter about this recently, that they actually turned up at the house in Henley Street and knocked on the door. And when the door was open, they said, here's your subpoena. You need to turn up in court. Now, this is much more difficult for John to avoid. And unfortunately, we don't have much record about these. We do have records which John Breed says, in the last 4 weeks, I've delivered 25 writs to various people in 6 counties from my master, James Langrake. But we don't have one saying, I delivered a writ to John Shakespeare. We do have documents in which people like John Breed and James Langrake tell the court, yes, I delivered a subpoena on such and such a date, at such and such an address to this person.
Well, with all of this, I mean, this is really sort of this I want to use the word rife. I mean, it was everywhere that there were these professional and they seemed to be pretty merciless about taking a person's assets or whatever they could get out of them. Why did John Shakespeare not lose his house? Because that
was interesting thing. Your goods and chattels were subject to seizure. That is, anything that was movable. They could take your furniture.
Which shows up in one of Shakespeare's plays. That phrase of mind my goods and chattels and movables.
I mean, it was a standard legal phrase that you find a lot of that in Shakespeare. He's very good at picking up standard legal phrases. Some people think that proves he was a country lawyer, but I don't agree with that. I think what it means is that William Shakespeare had this amazingly plastic mind. He could kind of go into a field of knowledge and remove from it what he needed to know for his dramatic purposes very, very quickly. It's astonishing. He's got this very highly intelligent brain that can see the essentials of something, take out what he needs and use it. That's his extraordinary range. But what his father was finding was that he was with hundreds, thousands of other people who were being essentially persecuted by a system. Now, we do know that Lord Burleigh tried to reform the system. When the parliamentary agitation got too noisy and loud to ignore, he decided to try and reform the system. What he did was not what we'd assumed to be reform. Lord Burleigh's major interest was to ensure that the Queen got her share of the fines. He didn't want to stop the imposition of fines on people who were breaking the law. So what he did was he arrested all the major informers, people like James Langrake and another dozen or so others, and put them in jail until they all agreed that they couldn't do side deals with people in the country about these writs without the license of the court, that they would not take any more writs corruptly from the Exchequer officials until they'd actually started a case, that they would always report the stages of the case to the judges of the Court of the Exchequer. And as far as we know, they did that. But it didn't stop them informing on people. That continued because from Burleigh's point of view, you had to enforce the law and make sure the Queen got her share of the fines. That was the important thing. No one suggested you should stop doing this. This is why it's a very different society from ours. So what William Shakespeare experienced was what many other people at that period experienced. But of course, he's one of the few people at the time who experienced this, who went on to write plays about justice and law and the enforcement of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law and so on. Obviously, Merchant of Venice is about the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law. Midsummer Night's Dream begins with problems caused by the rigid enforcement of the law rather than the equitable reading of the spirit of the law. There's all sorts of ways in which this turns up later. So John Shakespeare's experience wasn't extraordinary, it wasn't unique, but it was something that I think influenced young William Shakespeare's thinking, his way of looking at power and how it's exercised. Because after all, his father had suffered because powerful people at court were making money out of a corrupt system.
So you're saying Lord Burleigh is the reason that John Shakespeare didn't lose his house?
The law didn't allow them to take his house.
Oh, okay. So they had to stop there.
What they could take, if you died owing the Queen money, and we do have some documents that show this, what would happen was that the sheriff would go to the house of the person who died owing the Queen money, and they'd itemize every stick of furniture, every rug, every last item in the house, and they'd tot up how much they were worth. They'd use neighbors, sometimes the local jury, if there was substantial property, to assess how much everything was worth and say, okay, this person died with £12 worth of goods, he owes the Queen. The family could then raise £12, hand it to the sheriff, who'd hand it to the Exchequer, and they'd keep the family goods, or he'd just take everything and auction it off. So we have actual inventories of the contents of Elizabethan people's houses because they died in debt to the crown. They hadn't paid fines or they hadn't paid debts to the crown. The sheriff goes around and literally, their very last shirt, their second best bed, it is all itemized. That didn't happen to John because he died in 1601, by which time William was quite wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in Stratford. And so at some point, the debt was paid off. One of the problems with these records is that there are large gaps in them. The last time we've got John Shakespeare appearing on a list of debtors is somewhere around the 1581, 1582 period. And then there's a gap for about 3 years. And when the list appears, John Shakespeare's disappeared from it. There could be two reasons for this. One is that the Exchequer officials would regularly go through the list and write off certain debts as just uncollectible. They were called desperate debts. You couldn't collect them because the man had nothing. That is a possibility. The second reason why John Shakespeare disappeared from the list may be that somehow he sold land, he sold leases, he raised some money, and he did a deal. He was removed from the list. But we don't know because the documents simply haven't survived. In the early Elizabethan period, there's great holes in the record. And you don't really know until you open the box what's left. So John's experience was not terribly uncommon. There were thousands of people this happened to. The difference is that it was happening to the father of William Shakespeare.
We remember his experience specifically because we're chasing down Shakespeare's history.
So once again, William Shakespeare is a fairly typical Elizabethan. He had a fairly typical education for a young boy of his status, with a father who had been important, who had unfortunately fell on hard times, partly because of economic reasons, some people have argued, but also, I'd say, because he was targeted for his wealth by James Langrake, the informer. And in many ways, what John Shakespeare experienced was a process of losing rank, which annoys people, makes them very angry. Sociologists and psychologists today talk about a phenomenon called downranking. There are many people in Britain and Europe and the United States who feel that their status isn't what it used to be, that they've lost status. They're much poorer than they used to be, and they're angry. Well, in a sense, John Shakespeare and probably William Shakespeare was angry too. And I think what it meant was that it meant that William Shakespeare's reading of the Latin literature I've talked about, it really resonated with him, because in that literature, people like Tacitus, who was from a senatorial family, other people who had high status in Rome, suddenly realized that they'd lost political power to the emperor, that it wasn't now the Roman Republic run by virtuous senatorial families, well-educated men, but there were low-born people who were thugs and villains and secret policemen who were serving the monarch and doing very well out of it. Whereas the truly educated people, the elite, if you like, were being sidelined. And I think this literature, resonated with William, partly because when he got home, he could see his father, who'd been mayor of the town, an important alderman, and couldn't put his nose out of the door for fear of arrest for debt for long periods. So you can see why later on, William is so interested in issues of justice and equity and how the powerful bend and distort the law in their own interests.
It's that phrase about writers. We say writers write best what they know best.
Yeah, it's out of his experience. We have a lot of evidence in other parts of the book of other things going on in Stratford of the same nature. I've got a whole chapter on Adrian Quinney. As you know, Adrian Quinney was a contemporary colleague and friend of John Shakespeare. His son Richard was a little older than William, but they grew up together. The Quinneys were also badly dealt with by central government in another matter that ended up in the Exchequer. This is not about informers, but this is about, if you like, imposing the harsh letter of the law rather than being equitable in administering the law. It's a very complex story. I don't think we haven't got time to talk about it today.
Not today, but I think you have successfully drawn our attention to these incredible new documents and just the richness of this part of Shakespeare's history that has gone underexplored. I know I'm excited to see the documents and to read more about this. And I wondered if you could tell us some recommendations on where to learn more. I believe the documents that you have discovered, are they currently available on Shakespeare Documented, or are they about to be added?
They're going up right now. The Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. has this database website, as you know, called Shakespeare Documented. That has about 400 manuscripts all told at the moment, I think. And the 20 or so I've discovered are in the process of being put onto that website. They'll also be available fairly soon, I think, through the National Archives in London. Their website will have a link to them. They've been photographed. The photographs are really excellent quality. It's a matter of organizing them in a kind of comprehensible order and writing short descriptions of them. And I'll be writing an essay for the Folger to introduce these documents, because as my long, involved explanation of the sheriffs and the writs suggested, these documents cannot be taken at face value. Okay, it's important to read the essay I'll be writing, which says these documents don't actually mean the sheriff went looking for John Shakespeare and grabbed him. That's not what happened. The Elizabethan England, Tudor England, is full of legal fictions. It's full of processes that are supposed to have happened that actually didn't. And in fact, that takes me right back to the beginning, because you remember I started out talking about 5 documents that showed the court cases in which John Shakespeare was accused of usury and wall broking. Those are actually fiction. Those documents don't describe what actually happened. We've known about them for some time. They were written about in 1984, but it turns out that a lot of those kind of documents are not literally true. They are, if you like, a polite fiction that's required as part of the legal process. And you have to be very, very careful with Tudor legal documents not to take them at face value. It requires quite a lot of training to see through what the documents appear to be saying to what they're really saying. And with John Shakespeare, you have to be aware that because these documents are telling the sheriff, arrest John Shakespeare, that didn't actually happen. That it was part of a ritual that everyone had to go through. People did end up before the courts at Westminster. People did end up having to pay their fines. People did end up in prison. But it's not everyone. So we have to be very, very cautious.
I know we will definitely be reading the essay that you're writing up about this, and I can't wait for them to be available on Shakespeare Documented or at the National Archives. We'll definitely be on the lookout for that. And we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that is, what is your absolute favorite book of all time? Now, these are 1 to 2 titles you would take with you on a deserted island, and I'm told in the UK I'm supposed to allow you a copy of the Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare.
Yeah, I can't decide between the Geneva Bible that Shakespeare used and the King James Bible that came at the end of his life, but one of those will do. The complete works of Shakespeare, yes. Now, another title, this is a slight cheat. Any of the novels of Patrick O'Brian. These are the greatest series of historical novels ever written. And they're written about the Royal Navy in the Napoleonic War. And the reason why I think they're wonderful is I don't know anything about the Royal Navy in the Napoleonic Wars. This is why I can't read a historical novel about the 16th or 17th century before I get irritated.
You know too much about it.
Yeah, I know too much about it. Hilary Mantel's a very fine writer, but I had to work very hard to read through both her novels so far about Thomas Cromwell. Any of the books of Patrick O'Brian, I recommend them thoroughly to anybody who wants to read great historical novels.
We'll definitely look into those.
Yeah, there's 21 of them, 20 complete and 1 incomplete. And if you're lucky, your local library will have the complete series in a 5-volume kind of united edition.
What's next for you?
What's next? Well, right today, actually, I'm working very hard to finish a 10,000-word essay on a man called Thomas Digges. Thomas Digges was a great student of a man of whom I've written a book, John Dee, who's very well known in Elizabethan history, of course. Thomas Digges was probably the greatest mathematician of the Elizabethan period, but he's far more interesting than that, because Thomas Digges is a great figure in the history of science. All the history of science textbooks write about Thomas Digges, and there's no doubt he was a very, very smart man and a very, very fine mathematician. He wrote on geometry, he wrote on astronomy, he wrote on everything. But Thomas Digges was also a con man and a forger and a murderer. And what I've been writing about today is how his enemies turned that against him, how they used his character to blacken mathematics, because to contemporaries, how you behaved expressed what you knew. And wow. Thomas Digges' behavior was so appalling. He was just absolutely incorrigible. His behavior was so appalling that conservatives who wanted to blacken mathematics simply had to let it be known what he was like. At one point, he appeared before the Privy Council, accused of forgery and fraud and of, bad-mouthing his own patrons. And he admitted it all and then said, well, what are you going to do about it? And the Privy Council couldn't do anything, because what he should have done for forgery and perjury, which he's also guilty of, he was supposed to appear before the Star Chamber, which was the Privy Council plus the senior judges. And the Star Chamber could impose very severe punishments. It could imprison you for life for forgery. And it did so almost at the same time he was before the Privy Council. But they sent him to the Privy Council because his patrons still supported him to some extent and wanted to protect him from his enemies. And they knew that the Privy Council really couldn't punish people very harshly. So Thomas Digges got away with it. But he's an amazing character. This is a kind of test run for a book after the Shakespeare book about Thomas Digges. He's a great Elizabethan figure.
Dr. Glyn Parry, thank you so much for reminding us today that the study of William Shakespeare and the history of his life is very much alive and bristling with new things to find and discover. Thank you for being here and for sharing your joy of discovery with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you for very interesting questions. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. To find out more about Glyn Parry and the discovery he made at the National Archives about John Shakespeare, and even to see these documents yourself, because they are being uploaded digitally to Shakespeare Documented and on the National Archives London website. And when those become available, the links to that will be available in the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 24. That's CassidyCash.com/EP24. To get up close and personal with some of the history you learned about in today's episode, you can travel with That Shakespeare Girl in September 2019. I have partnered with British History Tours to offer the ultimate Shakespeare experience in London and Stratford, seeing where William Shakespeare worked, lived, and how he built his enduring legacy. We'll see places like the Globe Theatre, and you'll learn all about staging and performance and his life living in London and Stratford. To get all the details and to sign up to be notified when tickets go on general release later this year, visit CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.